Thanks, everybody. Welcome to Build. I'm your host, Ricky Camilleri. Our next guest represented New York's 16th District in the United States House of Representatives from 1973 to 1981, meaning she was in the House when the Judiciary Committee voted to move forward with impeachment proceedings against Richard Nixon. So, Elizabeth Holtzman knows a thing or two about impeachment proceedings, and it is with that she has published the new book, The Case for Impeaching Trump. And if anybody knows me, they know I'm down with that. Please welcome Elizabeth Holtzman.
Thank you, Ricky.
Thank you so much for being here.
I'm very excited to be here. Thanks.
And thank you for writing this book, because the case has been made. All of us feel like the case has been made, but we need someone like you to come forward to really say, oh yes, he has made the case for himself to get impeached.
Well, I was actually on the House Judiciary Committee that considered the whole question of impeaching Richard Nixon. It's the only impeachment process, by the way, that's ever worked in the history of this country. So, yes, I do, unfortunately, know a lot about the impeachment process. It's a kind of little niche expertise. Not too many people have it. I hope to God in this country we won't have to use it too often again. But I wrote this book because I looked at Donald Trump and I saw so many echoes of what happened during Watergate. The grounds that we used to impeach Richard Nixon were cropping right up with Donald Trump. So I wrote this book. It's a relatively short book. It doesn't say Trump should be impeached immediately, but it says that there's so much evidence in the public arena that we need to start investigations to pin down everything, to dot the I's and cross the T's so we can have solid evidence that impeachable crimes were committed. And if they weren't, well, so be it. But we can't just ignore what's right in front of us.
You say if they weren't, so be it. But do you feel like they were?
Oh yeah, I think that there's substantial evidence. I mean, now it's really in at least one instance. We had very many instances with regard to Nixon, so it wasn't just one item.
And
but
the committee
right
pursued 5 or 6 things, right? And
well, there were
passed,
three.
Right?
There were 3 articles of impeachment.
Right.
One dealt with all the things that he did to obstruct the investigation into Watergate, and there were many, many, many things. And then there were other things that had nothing to do with Watergate, called abuse of power. That had to do with illegal wiretaps, that had to do with breaking into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office to get information to smear him with, that had to do with creating an enemies list of political opponents of Richard Nixon and getting the IRS to do harassing audits. So there were a bunch of other things that had nothing to do with Watergate that were part of the impeachment process. So there were many, many grounds. But the one that's most obvious now is the offering of pardons. There's no question that Richard Nixon authorized the offering of presidential pardons to the burglars who broke into Watergate to keep them from talking to the special prosecutor. In other words, to have a cover-up which would not implicate him, his campaign, or his top aides. Well, the cover-up worked. Pardons were, in fact, offered. And that was one of the grounds, explicitly one of the grounds on which Richard Nixon, the vote in the House Judiciary Committee was based. Okay, fast forward to Donald Trump. We know that there have been reports in newspapers that Trump's lawyers may have offered pardons to Manafort, Flynn, maybe others. There was discussion about it. But we never had information until very recently that Trump himself was behind it. Now Trump says, well, I'm not taking a pardon for Manafort off the table. Why should I? So basically, he himself is admitting that he's dangling a pardon in front of Manafort. Why is he dangling that pardon? Because Manafort is being, quote unquote, strong and not cooperating with the special prosecutor. This is exactly the same thing that happened in Watergate. So we have at least one actual ground right now that would warrant impeachment. But I think you need more than that. We had much more than that with regard to Richard Nixon.
There's also the aspect of Manafort where apparently, I think Rudy Giuliani even said this. I mean, who knows what Giuliani says anymore when he gets in front of a camera. But he actually said that Manafort was faking the plea so that he could give information about the investigation to Trump's lawyers. And then after that, Trump said that he hasn't taken a plea or a pardon off the table, which to me is mind-bogglingly illegal, it seems.
Well, it could also be a crime. I'm not saying it's not a crime. I'm just talking about what I did, which is called the case for impeachment. And with regard to impeachment, It is, in fact, an established ground for impeachment. You dangle a pardon in front of somebody to keep that person from talking to a prosecutor. If that person could implicate you, that's an impeachable offense. And Trump has admitted to that, at least, with regard to Manafort. And there could be other pardon offers we don't know. That's what has to be investigated.
And now what are we? We're about 2 years into the Trump presidency right now. When did you first start to see that a case for impeaching him was starting to develop?
Well, I was getting very angry at Trump. I was angry at Trump from the get-go. But
me too.
And I was appalled at the various things he was doing, and then there were so many things that just were echoes of Watergate, as I've said. But early in the summer, late spring, an organization asked me to see if I could put together a case for impeachment. What would it look like? And I had never systematically sat down to say, well, what would a case look like against Donald Trump? And when I sat down to do it, to put all the pieces together, I said, oh, my God, and much more than I ever thought. And the case is much stronger than I ever thought, because we're overwhelmed every day. This bit of evidence, that bit of evidence, this outrage, that outrage. But no one's put it together in a package, tied a ribbon around it. So that's what I finally did. And when I finished the memo for this organization, I said, I think I should write a book about this. And so that's the genesis for it.
You said that we're overwhelmed by this thing that happens and this thing that happens. Do you think that if Trump was in a sort of deluge of controversy and criminal activity every day, every other day, that he kind of may have been impeached already, that one or two of these scandals would have stayed around a little bit longer?
That's possible, but the real reason that nothing has happened is because, sadly, the Republicans in Congress have refused to conduct really serious and thorough investigation. For example, some of the witnesses who came before them were never fully questioned. They weren't asked to produce certain documents. You can't have a half-hearted investigation. What happened in Watergate was that you had a Senate Select Committee that was headed by a Democrat. Republican Howard Baker was a senator from Tennessee, and he was a partisan of Richard Nixon's. Howard Baker started out with famous questions because he thought Nixon was innocent. So he asked every witness, what did the president know and when did he know it? And he thought, since the president didn't know anything and never did anything, that these questions would exonerate Nixon. But every witness was coming back and saying, oh, the president knew this then and the president did that then. And so he realized that the facts were there and they had to be pursued. And so Howard Baker, total partisan of Richard Nixon's, became an advocate for the truth and the facts. And the information that was produced by the Watergate Committee, Senate Watergate Committee, primarily on a bipartisan basis, included finding the Richard Nixon White House tapes, which were the final nail in his coffin. That information was turned over to the House Judiciary Committee for the impeachment process. So that kind of a thorough, bipartisan, no-holds-barred investigation has not been conducted either on the Senate side or the House side. That's what you have to do. You can't pull punches when we're talking about preserving our democracy.
Do you think Republicans in the Senate and in the House face any kind of punishment for dereliction of duty?
Well, I think something happened at the polls in November. Send a warning shot across their bow. Yeah. So I think what's going to happen now is that, of course, since the Democrats do control the House, I think there will be serious investigations. They should be serious, not a gotcha investigation, but a serious inquiry. Was there collusion with the Russians? I mean, that seems to be much more apparent now, and in fact, the collusion argument seems to be drawing to a conclusion, but they need to be investigating everything from the emoluments. The president has not separated himself from his businesses. And so the money that goes into his businesses by foreign governments, whether it's the government of Saudi Arabia, whether it's the government of Malaysia, whether it's the government of other countries, goes right into his pocket. The Constitution says, no, you cannot do that. No federal official can take any money from any foreign government, president or not. And the way you deal with it if you're president is you go to Congress and you say, Congress, because the Constitution allows the Congress to permit a president to take money from a foreign government. Hasn't often done that. And so but Trump has never gone to Congress and said, hey, let me keep this money. He just says, I don't have to obey the Constitution. I can keep whatever money comes to me. And of course, that raises some very serious questions. Is our policy about the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia based on the fact that he had a whole retinue of people staying at Trump's hotel in New York City for a long period of time? God knows how many millions of dollars came into his pocket. Is that something that's determining U.S. policy towards Saudi Arabia? Same with regard to Russia. Is Trump trying to get a hold in Moscow to build a big building? Is that what is driving his policy towards Russia, which was basically to kiss the ground in front of Putin? I mean, that's what the Constitution's framers tried to prevent. They were very worried that foreign governments would come and try to bribe a U.S. president. And here we are having a U.S. president who said, yeah, I can take money from foreign governments, but because it's going into my hotel and then into my pocket, it's not really an emolument. It's not really barred by the Constitution. So that's a potential ground for impeachment here, too, and must be investigated.
Now, obviously, you're a student of the Constitution, someone who knows very much about the Constitution. All of the arguments in the case for impeaching Trump discuss the framers, discuss very specific details within the Constitution. Has having someone like Trump running the country who is consistently flouting the Constitution, in a lot of ways, we are seeing where it doesn't work, where some stuff is just kind of tradition and some stuff that we believe someone should do rather than actual concrete law. Do you think that there should be a rewriting or a new understanding of what the Constitution is in this country? Does it hold up?
I mean, I think the framers had a pretty good idea. Was it perfect? The Constitution? Definitely not. It enshrined slavery. It also didn't recognize the equality of women. So we got that they made some really big mistakes. But they had some pretty good ideas about democracy itself, and they understood that unfettered power was a danger. They understood that democracy was precious and needed to be protected. They understood that a president could become like a king and threaten our democracy. And they put the power to protect the democracy in the hands of the House of Representatives and the Senate. They didn't put it in a court. They put it in the Congress because they understood that presidents could do very bad things. They didn't know when they wrote the impeachment clause of the Constitution that there'd be a Richard Nixon or a Donald Trump, but they knew there'd be rogue presidents in the future, and they wanted to protect against them. The real issue is why Congress has refused to take up the reins that the framers gave them to protect our democracy. It's not something they can just ignore. That's their responsibility. If you have a president who's gone rogue, who flouts the Constitution, who tries to put himself above the rule of law by obstructing, interfering, impeding, an investigation, a totally legitimate investigation into criminal conduct, then Congress has to act, and the people have to demand it from Congress. And that's what happened during Watergate, ultimately. It wasn't Congress that did it on its own. American people said, we've got to have a democracy. We can't have a president who can fire the special prosecutor. We're not a banana republic, and you, Congress, have to do your job. And that's what happened.
You know, I have to ask, it was a different media environment during Nixon's administration. Does it feel different now that no matter what the president does, he basically has a controlled media organization that will go to bat for him?
Look, when Nixon resigned after the House Judiciary Committee members unanimously supported his impeachment, including the most conservative Republicans, there was still 25% of the American people who supported him. 25% will support, we can assume, Donald Trump, no matter what. But that's not the issue. We have a majority rule in this country, and we have a rule of law. And if you decimate that, what's the future for any of us? The reason this country is a strong country is because we have a democracy here. And the minute you start tampering with that, we're really undermining our future. And that's what's at stake here.
You lay out the case for impeaching Trump for a number of different reasons. What do you think the strongest reason is?
Well, there are a lot of reasons now, but the one that everybody is, I think, very aware of is how he's interfered with and obstructed the investigation by Robert Mueller into possible collusion of his campaign with Russia. And he's done things that are kind of totally amazing and outrageous. and
I do
not
love that
acceptable.
no matter how much all of us don't like Trump, we can't help but get a little chuckle with how totally crazy some of the stuff is. That he
Yeah,
does.
right. Whether the attacks on it, offering pardons to people, encouraging maybe even witness tampering by what he's saying. I mean, the whole tweeting by the firing of Comey. I mean, the litany is huge, and I go into it in the book, but that's only one of the things he's done. The other thing, which I don't go into depth because we didn't really have all the facts at that point, is the possibility of actual collusion with Russia. Now it looks like there may very well have been what I consider to be the central nub of this, which is, what was this cover-up all about? What it may have been about, we don't 100% know, but we're beginning to see the outlines, is that the Russians promised Trump to help him in his election. They promised him money in his pocket through the building of a Trump hotel, in exchange for which, if he got elected, he was going to remove sanctions.
The Magnitsky Act.
Right. Yeah. So that looks like could have been the centerpiece of this. It would explain everything that's happened. We don't have all the pieces. But if that happened, obviously that would be a high crime and misdemeanor, colluding with a foreign government, conspiring with a foreign government to undermine an American election and to take money in the process. You may have three of the grounds of impeachment there. The grounds of impeachment are treason, bribery, high crimes and misdemeanors. You may have treason, bribery, and high crimes and misdemeanor all in one package if that turns out to be the case. We don't have the evidence, but the outlines of that are becoming much clearer, and it's very disturbing, troubling, and shocking.
You know, one of the classic lines from All the President's Men is when Deep Throat says to Bernstein, essentially, these were just a couple of guys who weren't very bright and things got out of hand. Does it feel a little like that with Trump and the team? No. No,
it's not that they weren't. The burglars may not have been the brightest lights, but it was the geniuses at the top of the campaign, Nixon's campaign. The Attorney General of the United States, John Mitchell, he went to prison because he gave the approval to this plan. So we're not talking about some, low-level dimwits. We're talking about, I'm not saying that John Mitchell was a genius, far from it, obviously. We know that because, he got caught. And this was a ridiculous idea to break into the Democratic National Committee. But anyway, he was the guy who orchestrated it. And we knew also beforehand that Nixon's top aides knew about it. Did Nixon himself orchestrate that? We still don't know that for sure to this day, but it doesn't matter. Nixon was so involved in illegal surveillance of all kinds, and the break-in that took place in Watergate was only followed the break-in that took place in Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office that Nixon knew about and approved. So could Nixon have orchestrated the break-in? Yeah. So don't say it was just, these low-level dimwits. It wasn't. It was at the highest levels. Mm-hmm. And if there was collusion with Russia, it wasn't at the lowest levels. It was at the highest levels. It was Donald Trump himself. That's what we saw in Watergate. Nixon orchestrated every part of it. Even though he was very busy as president, he orchestrated every part of it. You can be sure. And I'm not just saying it. We had the tapes. We had the White House tapes with Nixon's voice on it. And he said to Haldeman, his top aide, Haldeman, you get the CIA to stop the FBI investigation. Nixon's voice, Nixon's instructions, no doubt about it. That's what we had. That was the evidence. Because they wanted to stop the investigation into Watergate. Trump wants to stop, in the same way, the investigation into Russian collusion. And now we see the offers of Trump Tower. Now we see the discussions about getting rid of sanctions. Now we see the very serious fact of Russian help in the election, which Trump has totally tried to deny and minimize. I mean, yes, he says, oh, yeah, Russia, they could have interfered. But, China could have interfered. And there's this 400-pound guy in New Jersey. He could have been the real culprit. You always got to look to New Jersey, the fall guy.
I feel so bad for that 400-pound guy that's like, what did I do? I'm just sitting here on my
Yeah,
computer.
I'm playing on my computer. What do I know? Right.
You mentioned the Attorney General during Nixon. Just the last month, or a month and a half ago, Jeff Sessions was sort of forced to resign by the Trump administration, and Matthew Whitaker, who's essentially a Trump acolyte, was put in his place and has refused to recuse himself from the investigation, even though he's been on record stating that the investigation is a sham. Where do you think that could possibly impede Mueller's investigation at all?
I don't think Mueller's going to allow himself to be impeded. He's a very smart guy, and he's got very smart people there. But if Mr. Whitaker tries to impede the investigation, he himself could be not only subject to impeachment, but subject to prosecution for obstruction of justice. So I'd be very careful if I were Mr. Whitaker. Very careful.
Do you think he knows that?
Yeah, I think he's got an inkling about it, because the word is that he's not actually supervising the investigation, that the Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein, isn't supervising it. And that's because he knows that if he supervised it and came down hard or tried to squelch anything that Mueller did, he'd be subject to very serious repercussions for that. Let's
get some questions from our audience. Who has a question? Right here.
So we've made the case for impeachment, but that's not the story that we have to follow, which is the House Judiciary Committee. And Jerry Nadler is the linchpin in deciding what happens at the Judiciary Committee. And as you know, he's set forth a three-part test for the proceeding. He says you have to have clear and convincing evidence of a wrong so grave that a percentage of the opposition will agree that, yes, impeachment was necessary. Now,
Well,
I don't know if I agree with that test, because it
but the
suggests
point
that
is-
the conclusion has to come before the
Well,
proceeding.
I don't, look, when I was there and we had Watergate and Nixon fired the special prosecutor, up to that point, the Democrats in the House of Representatives didn't want to do anything. Nothing, even though we had all this testimony in the Senate Watergate Committee about Nixon's wrongdoing. Nobody wanted to do anything. The American people forced the House Judiciary Committee and Congress to act. The American people can force Congress to act here. They have the power. They did in the past. They can now. The standard that you're telling me that Jerry's talking about is basically the standard we used ourselves in the impeachment of Richard Nixon. The standard was not commission of a crime. The standard was an egregious misuse of the powers of the office of the presidency that undermined the rule of law, that subverted the Constitution, or that threatened the American people's civil liberties. That was the standard. So it was egregious. It wasn't, in the end, we had evidence that President Nixon filed false tax returns. He was not impeached on that ground. People didn't think it was of the level as ordering a break-in into a psychiatrist's office to get evidence illegally about somebody to smear them with. So that was the difference, or setting up an enemies list, or illegal wiretapping. So the House Judiciary Committee during Watergate made very smart distinctions about what was a ground for impeachment. And the grounds were the egregious misuse of power.
Good.
So,
Okay.
as the French say, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more things change, the more they are the same.
Now, I have to ask, before we move on to other questions, I think one of the things that we don't discuss at all, and I haven't really seen you answer questions because everyone wants to talk about Nixon and impeachment, but you were a woman in Congress on the Capitol in 1971. 72, excuse me.
Well, I took office in 73. Yeah.
For some context there, I don't think birth control had been made legal in this country yet at that point, right?
Griswold versus Connecticut had already been decided.
That had already been decided, excuse me. But
I don't go that far back. Stone Age, I'm not there.
Women didn't have the right to vote. No, I'm just kidding. What was the Capitol like at that time for a woman?
Well, just to give you an idea, Barbara Jordan, who served on the House Judiciary Committee with me, we were the first two women ever to serve on the House Judiciary Committee. But there we were part of that process. They didn't throw us off and say, oh, you're just women and you can't be on this. So there we were. And one of the interesting things is I still have people coming up to me and saying, I saw you during the Watergate hearings, and I never knew that women could be lawyers and do what you're doing. And they said to me I had become a role model. I had no idea that that was the case. So, yes, Barbara Jordan and I became role models because women saw us performing in that capacity. Also, in the House of Representatives, you have something called the seniority system, which is not necessarily merit-based. It's based on longevity and winning elections. The more elections you win and the more you've in the House of Representatives, the more power you get. And so that's good for people who could be discriminated against otherwise. Because if you're a woman and you've lived long enough and you're next in line, they can't stop you from, or they couldn't then, basically stop you from becoming the chair of a subcommittee or chair of a full committee. And I became a chair of a subcommittee after 3 terms in the House of Representatives. So that was very exciting for me and opened up, gave me an opportunity for power. But of course, now we have 100 women in the House of Representatives. When I came, there were fewer than 20. But, what we did was, and I was very proud to be part of this, I helped to form, along with a Republican from Massachusetts, a Republican woman from Massachusetts, Congresswomen's Caucus, so that we could work together, the tiny handful of women, Republicans and Democrats, on issues affecting the status of women. That organization is still there in the Congress, and it's still bipartisan. It still works on behalf of women. So even though the numbers were small, we used our power wisely and well.
What was it like watching this recent midterm election, where a blue wave was largely led by women?
It was great. I thought when I was elected in 1973, I had no idea that there were so few women in the House of Representatives. I had no idea when I was elected that I was the youngest woman ever elected. I had no idea I would keep that record for 42 years, which was a terrible thing. It should have been broken right away, but it wasn't. But I was able to see these important changes in the House of Representatives and in the country. So it's great to see. And I also thought, by the way, that after I was elected, there'd be all these other people elected, all these other women elected, but it didn't happen. It was really hard because there's so many stereotypes against women and so difficult. It was so very difficult for women to run for office. But it's gotten much better, and that's great for the country, because all of us need to be at the table. Women as well as men, people of different religions, different backgrounds, young people as well as older people. And that's what was great about this past election. It wasn't just that the Democrats won, which was really important, it seemed to me, not just for the Democratic Party, but for the country, given how the Republicans were dealing with Trump. But it was great reaffirmation of the strength of our diversity and how that really makes us a stronger nation than many nations in the world.
Has it been surprising to you that on the other side of the aisle, the Republicans have a dwindling number of women in their caucuses?
Yeah, I know. I saw there's a woman called Elise Stefanik. She broke my record initially. So we became sort of friends, not really friends, but we know each other now because...
High-fived when you saw each other.
Yeah. And she got in trouble because she said, I think we talking about the Republicans, have to look at what's happened to us. She said, look at all these new members who were elected on the Democratic side, all these women. We lost the suburban women. We only elected one new woman. So, and she got in trouble for pointing that out in 2018. So it shows that there's still forces at work trying to keep women down. But, it took a long time from 1973 to 2018-19. But, you can't keep progress down ultimately. Long term, you just can't keep the forces of freedom and of opportunity. You can't restrict that. And, that was a great sign for America.
Damn right. 2 more questions. What do we got?
Hi. First off, I just wanted to say thank you for coming in. But my question is, outside of voting, which I hope everyone in here did vote, what do you think is the most effective thing that civilians can do to help move this case along?
Well, first of all, you should read my book, The Case for Impeaching Trump. Then you should.
Do whatever you want. Read it again. Buy another copy. Yeah.
Give it to your friends. Buy it for your friends. Give it to your friends and family for Christmas, for Hanukkah, for New Year's, whatever. But seriously, know what the facts are, and then contact your representative in Congress and say, You got to be moving on this. You've got to insist on serious investigations. We need to know the facts. In Watergate, under Nixon, the Congress got at the facts. Congress, we have Trump there. You've got to get the facts. And that's what you need to do. You write to your member of Congress or email or visit his or her office and say, what are you doing about it? I want to know what you're doing about it. And that kind of pressure is what changed. That's what kind of pressure is what led to the impeachment. When Richard Nixon fired Archibald Cox, the special prosecutor, Washington was flooded, totally flooded with, I mean, this is old-fashioned, but telegrams, telephone calls, people went to district offices. The country was up in arms, and they expressed it, and Congress responded. If you do that, that's the kind of thing you have to do.
Do you think that's not happening now?
Well, I'm sure it is happening to some extent, but it could happen more.
Do you think
more intensely?
Do you think if I sent my congressman a telegram now, they would be so floored by my
they might
my
pay
whimsy
attention
that
to
they
it.
might do something?
Right? They'd say, "Wow, this is something new."
So whimsical. I'll take it up. I think we have time for one more question.
Hi. So since there are plenty of cases for impeaching Trump and the many similarities that has been made over the course of his presidency between him and Nixon, what would you hope for would be the final blow for him to Congress to finally look into his impeachment, like the last thing, even
Nail in the coffin.
Yeah, the nail in the coffin. Yeah.
Well, I think there are a lot of nails. I don't think there's just one, and I think if you just rely on one, it's not going to work. We had many with regard to Richard Nixon, many, and that's what also solidified the case. Most important thing is to get the evidence. That's what ultimately persuaded the American people and the Republicans and the conservative Southern Democrats that impeachment was warranted. So you have to have. So the evidence is one thing, and they have to be looking very carefully at the emoluments, the money going into Trump's pocket from his businesses. You also they have to be looking at very carefully Trump's interferences with the special prosecutor Mueller, special counsel Mueller. They have to be looking at the collusion with Russia. These are things that are critical. But the other part of this, and I didn't really emphasize this enough, but as important as the solid evidence was the bipartisan approach that was taken. The chair of the committee from New Jersey, Peter Rodino, decided that he was going to have, this was not going to be viewed as a partisan measure. Why? Because Nixon, unlike Trump, was elected in a landslide, in one of the largest landslides in the history of the United States. And Peter Rodino understood that if it was the Democrats just throwing out a Republican president who had been elected in a landslide, the country wouldn't stand for it. So he tried to make sure that the process was as fair, as bipartisan as possible. So to give you an example, the general counsel for the impeachment inquiry that Peter Rodino hired was a Republican. Think about it. The Democrats picked a Republican to be our counsel. And, of course, the Republicans picked a Republican. So there were two
similar
Republicans.
to Mueller right now as well, picking Mueller to run the special counsel.
Right, but that wasn't the Democrats who did that. That was Rod Rosenstein. But this was a signal to the country, to the Congress, that the process was going to be as nonpartisan, as bipartisan, as fair as possible. And so that has to be part of whatever happens, to try to make sure that everybody feels that the process is fair, because that is really critical. And I'll tell you also, not only did we have two Republican counsels running the impeachment inquiry, but it was a small group of conservative Democrats and moderate Republicans who wrote the articles of impeachment. Why? Because it showed that if they could get together as a group, conservative Democrats, more moderate Republicans, that would be something that the country could respond to as not a partisan effort to get rid of a president. And so those are the two things that are critical. Solid evidence, fair process.
You know, I have to ask, and I ask people this all the time when I'm talking about politics and talking about Trump. When you talk about people calling their congressmen, their congresswomen, Have you seen a slight silver lining with Trump being president in the sense that people are more actively engaged in the political atmosphere than they've ever been before? I mean, more so than even the Bush administration when we were at war. It feels like people are actively engaged.
Well, if that's a silver lining, I guess so. I mean, it's pretty terrible to have these terrible things happen in order to prompt people to realize how important their vote is. We take a lot of things for granted in this country. We take our democracy for granted. Framers understood democracy was a very fragile thing, and you couldn't take it for granted, and it required constant vigilance. So people understood, I don't have to, now that when they said, in 2016, I don't have to vote, my vote doesn't count. We see now how close elections are and that every vote counts. And so many, many people, including many, many people who were on that first Women's March, had not voted and felt very guilty about it. And I think none of us can take for granted our democracy. That's why we have to be informed, read my book. That's why we have to vote. That's why we have to pressure our members of Congress to do the right thing. We have to be vigilant. We can't just leave it to somebody else. Nobody else is going to protect this country in the end. It's going to be us.
Absolutely. The book is on shelves now in stores on Amazon. It's called The Case for Impeaching Trump. And everybody, please give a big round of applause for Congresswoman Elizabeth Holtzman. Let's hear it.
Thank you.